Axiom 2. The war machine is the invention of the nomads, insofar as it is exterior to the state apparatus and distinct from the military institution. As such, the war machine has three aspects: a spatio-geographic aspect, an arithmetic or algebraic aspect, and an affective aspect. Proposition 5. Nomad existence necessarily effectuates the conditions of the war machine in space. The nomad has a territory. He follows customary paths. He goes from one point to another. He is not ignorant of points, water points, dwelling points, assembly points, etc. But the question is, what in nomad life is a principle and what is only a consequence? To begin with, although the points determine paths, they are strictly subordinated to the paths they determine, the reverse of what happens with the sedentary. The water point is reached only in order to be left behind. Every point is a relay and exists only as a relay. A path is always between 2 points, but the in-between has taken on all the consistency and enjoys both an autonomy and a direction of its own. The life of the nomad is the intermezzo. Even the elements of his dwelling are conceived in terms of the trajectory that is forever mobilizing them. The nomad is not at all the same as the migrant, for the migrant goes principally from one point to another, even if the second point is uncertain, unforeseen, or not well localized. But the nomad only goes from point to point as a consequence and as a factual necessity. In principle, points for him are relays along a trajectory. Nomads and migrants can mix in many ways or form a common aggregate. Their causes and conditions are no less distinct for that. For example, those who joined Muhammad at Medina had a choice between a nomadic or Bedouin pledge, a pledge of hijra or emigration. Secondly, even the nomadic trajectory may follow trails or customary routes, or it does not fulfill the function of a sedentary road, which is to parcel out a closed space to people, assigning each person a share and regulating the communication between shares. The nomadic trajectory does the opposite. It distributes people or animals in an open space, one that is indefinite and non-communicating. The nomos came to designate the law, but that was originally because it was a distribution, a mode of distribution. It is a very special kind of distribution, one without division into shares, in a space without borders or enclosure. The nomos is the consistency of a fuzzy aggregate. It is in this sense that it stands in opposite to the law or the polis as the backcountry, a mountainside, or the vague expanse around a city, either nomos or polis. There is therefore, and this is the third point, a significant difference between the spaces. Sedentary space is striated by walls, enclosures, and roads between enclosures, while nomad space is smooth, marked only by traits that are effaced and displaced with the trajectory. Even the lamella of the desert slide over each other, producing an inimitable sound. The nomad distributes himself in a smooth space. He occupies, inhabits, holds that space. That is his territorial principle. It is therefore false to define the nomad by movement. Toynbee is profoundly right to suggest that the nomad is, on the contrary, he who does not move. Whereas the migrant leaves behind a milieu that has become amorphous or hostile, the nomad is one who does not depart, does not want to depart, who clings to the smooth space left by the receding forest, where the steppe or the desert advance, and who invents nomadism as a response to this challenge. Of course, the nomad moves, but while seated, and he is only seated while moving. The Bedouin, galloping, knees on his saddle, sitting on the soles of his upturned feet, a feat of balance. The nomad knows how to wait. He has infinite patience, immobility and speed, catatonia and rush, a stationary process, station as process. These traits of Kleist's are eminently those of the nomad. It is thus necessary to make a distinction between speed and movement. A movement may be very fast, but that does not give it speed. A speed may be very slow or even immobile, yet it is still speed. Movement is extensive, speed is intensive. Movement designates the relative character of a body considered as one, which goes from point to point. Speed, on the contrary, constitutes the absolute character of a body whose irreducible parts, atoms, occupy or fill a smooth space in the manner of a vortex, with the possibility of springing up at any point. It is therefore not surprising that reference has been made to spiritual voyages effected without relative movement, but in intensity, in one place. These are part of nomadism. In short, we will say by convention that only the nomad has absolute movement. In other words, speed. Vortical or swirling movement is an essential feature of his war machine. It is in this sense that the nomad has no points, paths, or land, even though he does by all appearances. If the nomad can be called the deterritorialized par excellence, it is precisely because there is no re-territorialization afterwards, as with the migrant, or upon something else, as with the sedentary. The sedentary's relation with the earth is mediatized by something else, a property regime, a state apparatus. With the nomad, on the contrary, it is deterritorialization that constitutes the relation to the earth, to such a degree that the nomad re-territorializes on deterritorialization itself. It is the earth that deterritorializes itself in a way that provides the nomad with a territory. The land ceases to be land, tending to become simply ground or support. The earth does not become deterritorialized in its global and relative movement, but at specific locations, at the spot where the forest recedes, or where the steppe and the desert advance. Huback is right to say that nomadism is explainable less by universal changes in climate, which relate instead to migrations, as by the divergation of local climates. Divagation? The nomad is there on the land, wherever there forms a smooth space that gnaws and tends to grow in all directions. The nomad inhabits these places. He remains in them, and he himself makes them grow, for it has been established that the nomad takes the desert no less than he is made by it. He is a vector of deterritorialization. He adds desert to desert, step to step, by a series of local operations, the orientation and direction of which endlessly vary. The sand desert does not only have oases, which are like fixed points, but also rhizomatic vegetation that is temporary and shifts location according to local rains, bringing changes in the direction of the crossings. The same terms are used to describe ice deserts as sand deserts. There is no line separating earth and sky. There is no intermediate distance, no perspective or contour. Visibility is limited, and yet there is an extraordinarily fine topology that does not rely on points or objects, but on hikayetes, on sets of relations. Winds, undulations of snow or sand, the song of the sand or the creaking of ice, the tactile qualities of both. It is a tactile space, or rather haptic, a sonorous much more than a visual space. The variability, the polyvocity of directions is an essential feature of smooth spaces of the rhizome type, and it alters their cartography. The nomad space, is localized and not delimited. What is both limited and limiting is striated space, the relative global. It is limited in its parts, which are assigned constant directions, are oriented in relation to one another, divisible by boundaries, and can be fit together. What is limiting, limes or wall, and no longer boundary, in this composite in relation to the smooth spaces it contains, the growth of which it slows or prevents, and which it restricts or places outside. Even when the nomad sustains its effects, he does not belong to this relative global where one passes from one point to another, from one region to another. Rather, he is in a local absolute, an absolute that is manifested locally and engendered in a series of local operations of varying orientations: desert, steppe, ice, sea. Making the absolute appear in a particular place, is that not a very general characteristic of religion? Making the absolute appear in a particular place, is that not a very general characteristic of religion? Recognizing that the nature of the appearance and the legitimacy, or lack thereof, of the images which produce it are open to debate. But the sacred place of religion is fundamentally a centre which repels the obscure nomos. The absolute of religion is essentially a horizon that encompasses, and if the absolute itself appears at a particular place, it does so in order to establish a solid and stable centre for the global. The encompassing role of smooth spaces, desert, steppe, or ocean, in monotheism has been frequently noted. In short, religion converts the absolute. Religion is in this sense a piece in the state apparatus, in both of its forms, the bond and the pact or alliance. Even if it has within itself the power, puissance, to elevate this model to the level of the universal, or to constitute an absolute imperium. But for the nomad, the terms of the question are totally different. Locality is not delimited. The absolute then does not appear at a particular place, but becomes a non-limited locality. The coupling of the place and the absolute is not achieved in a centered, oriented globalization or universalization, but in an infinite succession of local operations. Limiting ourselves to this opposition between points of view, it may be observed that nomads do not provide a favorable terrain for religion. The man of war is always committing an offense against the priest or the god. The nomads have a vague, literally vagabond monotheism, and content themselves with that and with their ambulant fires. There is among the nomads a sense of the absolute, but a singularly atheistic one. The universalist religions that have had dealings with nomads, Moses, Mohammed, even Christianity with his Nestorian heresy, have always encountered problems in this regard and have run up against what they have termed obstinate impiety. These religions are not in effect separable from a firm and constant orientation, from an imperial state of right even, and especially in the absence of a state in fact. They have promoted an ideal of sedentarization and addressed themselves more to the migrant components than the nomadic ones. Even early Islam favoured the theme of the hijra, or migration, over nomadism. Rather, it was by way of certain schisms, such as the Khariji movement, that it won over the Arab or Berber nomads. Won over or won over? The latter, probably. It was by way of certain schisms that it won over the Arab or Berber nomads. Maybe they're making a pun. However, it is not an exhaustive approach to establish a simple opposition between 2 points of view: religion, nomadism. For monotheistic religion, at the deepest level of its tendency to project a universal or spiritual state over the entire ecumenon, is not without ambivalence or fringe areas. It goes beyond even the ideal limits of the state, even the imperial state entering a more indistinct zone, and outside of states where it has the possibility of undergoing a singular mutation or adaptation. we are referring to religion as an element in a war machine, and the idea of holy war as the motor of that machine. The prophet, as opposed to the state personality of the king and the religious personality of the priest, traces the movement by which a religion becomes a war machine, or passes over to the side of such a machine. It has often been said that Islam and the Prophet Muhammad performed such a conversion of religion and constituted a veritable esprit de corps. In the formula of Georges Bataille, quote, "Early Islam, a society reduced to the military enterprise," end quote. This is what the West invokes in order to justify its antipathy towards Islam. Yet the Crusades were a properly Christian adventure of this type. The prophets may very well condemn nomad life. The war machine may very well favour the movement of migration and the ideal of establishment. Religion in general may very well compensate for its specific deterritorialization with a spiritual and even physical reterritorialization, which in the case of the Holy War assumes the well-directed character of a conquest of the Holy Lands as the centre of the world. But despite all of that, when religion sets itself up a war machine, it mobilizes and liberates a formidable charge of nomadism, or absolute deterritorialization. It doubles the migrant with an accompanying nomad, or with the potential nomad the migrant is in the process of becoming, and finally it turns its dream of an absolute state back against the state form. And this turning is no less a part of the essence of religion than that dream. The history of the Crusades is marked by the most astonishing series of directional changes. The firm orientation towards the Holy Lands as a centre to reach often seems nothing more than a pretext. But it would be wrong to say that the play of self-interest or economic, commercial or political factors diverted the crusade from its pure path. The idea of the crusade in itself implies this variability of directions, broken and changing, and intrinsically possesses all these factors or all these variables from the moment it turns religion into a war machine, and simultaneously utilizes and gives rise to the corresponding nomadism. The necessity for maintaining the most rigorous of distinctions between sedentaries, migrants, and nomads does not preclude de facto mixes. On the contrary, it makes them in turn all the more necessary, and it is impossible to think of the general process of sedentarization that vanquished the nomads without also envisioning the gusts of local nomadization that carried off sedentaries and doubled migrants, notably to the benefit of religion. Smooth or nomad space lies between two striated spaces, that of the forest with its gravitational verticals, and that of agriculture with its grids and generalized parallels. Its now independent arborescence, its art of extracting the tree and wood from the forest. But being between also means that smooth space is controlled by these two flanks which limit it, oppose its development, and assign it as much as possible a communicational role. Or on the contrary, it means that it turns against them, gnawing away at the forest on one side, and on the other side gaining ground on the cultivated lands, affirming a non-communicating force, or a force of divergence, like a wedge digging in. The nomads turn first against the forest and the mountain dwellers, then descend upon the farmers. What we have here is something like the flip side of the outside of the state form. But in what sense? This form, as a global or relative space, implies a certain number of components: forest clearing of fields, agriculture grid laying, animal raising subordinated to agricultural work and sedentary food production, commerce based on a constellation of town-country, or polis-nomos communications. When historians inquire into the reasons for the victory of the West over the Orient, they primarily mention the following characteristics, which put the Orient in general at a disadvantage: deforestation rather than clearing for planting, making it extremely difficult to extract or even to find wood. Cultivation of the type rice paddy and garden rather than arborescence and field. Animal raising, for the most part outside the control of the sedentaries, with the result that they lacked animal power and meat foods. The low communication content for the town-country relation, making commerce far less flexible. The conclusion is not that the state form is absent in the Orient. Quite to the contrary, a more rigid agency becomes necessary in order to retain and reunite the various components plied by escape vectors. States have always had the same composition. If there is even one truth in the political philosophy of Hegel, it is that every state carries within itself the essential moments of its existence. States are not only made up of people, but of wood, fields or gardens, animals and commodities. There is a unity of composition of all states, but states have neither the same development nor the same organization. In the Orient, the components are much more disconnected, disjointed, necessitating a great immutable form to hold them together. Despotic formations, Asian or African, are rocked by incessant revolts, by secessions and dynastic changes, which nevertheless do not affect the immutability of the form. In the West, on the other hand, the interconnectedness of the components makes possible transformations of the state form through revolution. It is true that the idea of revolution itself is ambiguous. It is Western insofar as it relates to a transformation of the state, but Eastern insofar as it envisions the destruction, the abolition of the state. The great empires of the Orient, Africa and America, run up against wide open, smooth spaces that penetrate them and maintain gaps between their components. The nomos does not become countryside. The countryside does not communicate with the town. Large-scale animal raising is the affair of the nomads, etc. The Oriental state is in direct confrontation with a nomad war machine. The war machine may fall back to the road of integration and proceed solely by revolt and dynastic change. Nevertheless, it is the war machine, as nomad, that invents the abolitionist dream and reality. Western states are much more sheltered in their striated space, and consequently have much more latitude in holding their components together. They only confront the nomads indirectly, through the intermediary of the migrations the nomads trigger or adopt as their stance. One of the fundamental tasks of the state is to striate the space over which it reigns, or to utilize smooth spaces as a means of communication in the service of striated space. It is a vital concern of every state not only to vanquish nomadism, but to control migrations and more generally to establish a zone of rights over an entire exterior, over all the flows traversing the ecumenon. If it can help it, the state does not dissociate itself from a process of capture of flows of all kinds, populations, commodities or commerce, money or capital, etc. There is still a need for fixed paths in well-defined directions, which restrict speed, regulate circulation, relativize movement, and measure in detail the relative movements of subjects and objects. This is why Paul Virilio's thesis is important, when he shows that the political power of the state is polis, police, that is, management of the public ways, and that, quote, the gates of the city, its levees and duties are barriers, filters against the fluidity of the masses, against the penetration power of migratory packs, end quote, people, animal and goods. Gravity, gravitas, such is the essence of the state. It is not at all that the state knows nothing of speed, but it requires that movement, even the fastest, cease to be the absolute state of a moving body occupying a smooth space, to become the relative characteristic of a moved body going from one point to another in a striated space. In this sense, the state never ceases to decompose, recompose, and transform movement, or to regulate speed. the state as town surveyor, converter, or highway interchange. The role of the engineer from this point of view. Speed and absolute movement are not without their laws, but they are the laws of the nomos, of the smooth space that deploys it, of the war machine that populates it. If the nomads formed the war machine, it was by inventing absolute speed, by being synonymous with speed. And each time there is an operation against the state, subordination, rioting, guerrilla warfare, or revolution as act, it can be said that a war machine has revived, that a new nomadic potential has appeared, accompanied by the reconstitution of a smooth space, or a manner of being in space as though it were smooth. Virilio discusses the importance of the riot, or revolutionary theme of quote-unquote holding the street. It is in this sense that the response of the state against all that threatens to move beyond it is to striate space. The state does not appropriate the war machine without giving even it the form of relative movement. This was the case with the model of the fortress as the regulator of movement, which was precisely the obstacle the nomads came up against, the stumbling block and parry by which absolute vortical movement was broken. Conversely, when a state does not succeed in striating its interior or neighbouring space, the flows traversing that state necessarily adopt the stance of a war machine directed against it, deployed in a hostile or rebellious smooth space, even if other states are able to slip their striations in. And this was the adventure of China. Toward the end of the 14th century, and in spite of its very high level of technology in ships and navigation, it turned its back on its huge maritime space, saw its commercial flows turn against it and ally themselves with piracy, and was unable to react except by a politics of immobility, of the massive restriction of commerce, which only reinforces the connection between commerce and the war machine. The situation is much more complicated than we have led on. The sea is perhaps principal among smooth spaces, the hydraulic model par excellence. But the sea is also, of all smooth spaces, the first one attempts were made to striate. The sea is also, of all smooth spaces, the first one attempts were made to striate. I'm going to assume that this sentence is the wrong way around. I'll attempt to rectify it. But the sea is also, of all smooth spaces, the first one where attempts were made to striate, to transform into a dependency of the land with its fixed routes, constant directions, relative movements, a whole counter-hydraulic of channels and conduits. One of the reasons for the hegemony of the West was the power, puissance, of its state apparatuses to striate the sea, by combining the technologies of the North and the Mediterranean, and by annexing the Atlantic. But this undertaking had the most unexpected result. The multiplication of relative movements, the intensification of relative speeds in striated space, ended up reconstituting a smooth space, or absolute movement. As Virilio emphasizes, the sea became the place of the fleet in being, where one no longer goes from one point to another, but rather holds space beginning from any point. Instead of striating space, one occupies it with a vector of deterritorialization and perpetual motion. This modern strategy was communicated from the sea to the air as the new smooth space, but also to the entire earth considered as desert or sea, as converter and capturer. The state does not just relativize movement, it brings back absolute movement. It does not just go from the smooth to the striated, it reconstitutes smooth space. It brings back the smooth in the wake of the striated. It is true that this new nomadism accompanies a worldwide war machine, the organization of which exceeds the state apparatuses and passes into energy, military-industrial, and multinational complexes. We say this as a reminder that smooth space and the form of exteriority do not have an irresistible revolutionary calling, but change meaning drastically depending on the interactions they are part of and the concrete conditions of their exercise or establishment. For example, the way in which total war and popular war, and even guerrilla warfare, borrow one another's methods.